A waterway that has never been fully closed in modern history, shut down. Not for a day, not for a week, for months. 20 million barrels of oil per day gone, vanished from global markets overnight. And here is what most people are missing entirely. The countries that depended on this strait the most, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, are not responding the same way. Some of them are moving faster than anyone expected. Some are quietly negotiating with the very power that closed the gate. And at least one of them has made a structural decision that will permanently change how this region operates, whether the strait reopens or not. This is not a story about a blockade. This is a story about who gets to control the future of energy and who gets left behind. The Strait of Hormuz is 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. That is roughly the distance from one side of a major city to the other. And through that gap, every single day, in normal times, pass enough oil tankers to supply the energy needs of China, Japan, South Korea, and most of Europe simultaneously. It sits between Iran to the north and Oman to the south. Iran controls the northern shore. Oman controls the southern shore. Every tanker must pass through the territorial waters of at least one of them. This is not a vulnerability that was created recently. This vulnerability has existed for decades. The difference is, until February 2026, no one had actually used it. What changed? A war. A decision by Tehran to turn geography into leverage. And suddenly every assumption that Gulf states had built their economies on every pipeline plan, every LNG terminal, every Vision 2030 projection, had to be recalculated. But here is what I want you to understand before we go deeper. This crisis did not create the fractures between Gulf states. It exposed them. And that exposure is going to outlast whatever deal eventually reopens the strait. To understand why these fractures exist, you need to go back not to 2026, not even to the Abraham Accords, but to 1971. That is when Britain withdrew from the Persian Gulf. Overnight, 6 small states, some of them barely a generation old as modern entities, were left to manage their own security in a neighborhood that included Iraq, Iran, and a Cold War that had no intention of staying out of the region. They formed the Gulf Cooperation Council in 1981. The Iran-Iraq War had just begun. The idea was simple: collective security, shared interests, a unified voice. What actually happened is more complicated. Saudi Arabia had oil reserves and landmass. Qatar had gas, the largest single gas field on the planet, shared with Iran. The UAE had ports and ambition. Kuwait had proximity to every major threat. Oman had geography, 2 coastlines, one of them outside the strait entirely. And Bahrain had the U.S. Fifth Fleet, same council. Radically different strategic positions. For decades, those differences were manageable. The strait stayed open. Oil flowed. The money came in. Then the strait closed. And every single difference that had been papered over for 40 years became impossible to ignore. Before we go deeper into what each of these countries is actually doing, if this kind of structural analysis helps you understand what is really happening in the world, take 2 seconds to subscribe and hit like. And tell me in the comments, are Gulf states moving toward a new, unified framework after this crisis? Or is this the beginning of the GCC fracturing permanently? Tell me below. I read every single one. Let's start with Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is the one Gulf state that entered this crisis with a genuine structural advantage. Up until February 2026, Saudi Arabia was moving roughly 6 to 7 million barrels of oil per day through the Strait of Hormuz. But Saudi Arabia also had something no other Gulf state had at scale: an alternative, the East-West Pipeline. Built in 1981 during the last major Gulf War, it runs 1,200 kilometers from the oil fields of eastern Saudi Arabia, directly to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. Capacity: 7 million barrels per day. When the strait closed, Saudi Arabia activated that pipeline at full capacity. Within weeks, flotillas of tankers had redirected to Yanbu. The oil kept moving. And here is what you need to understand about that. Saudi Arabia did not just survive the closure. Saudi Arabia demonstrated for the first time in a live crisis that it could export its full production without the strait. That is not a small thing. That is a fundamental shift in Saudi Arabia's bargaining position with everyone. With Iran, with the United States, with its own neighbors, and with the energy markets that still set the price of its oil. What's particularly revealing is what Saudi Arabia did next. Rather than simply waiting for the crisis to resolve, Riyadh began evaluating an expansion of that same east-west pipeline. Debottlenecking, additional pumping capacity. The message was clear. This bypass is no longer a contingency plan. It is the new baseline. The crisis didn't weaken Saudi Arabia's position. It strengthened it. But that same advantage that Saudi Arabia has, Kuwait doesn't have it. Qatar doesn't have it. And that asymmetry is now shaping everything. The UAE entered this crisis in a different position than Saudi Arabia, more exposed in some ways, more aggressive in its response. The UAE had already built bypass infrastructure. The ADCOP pipeline, Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, runs from Abu Dhabi's interior oil fields to Fujairah, a port city on the Gulf of Oman, outside the strait entirely. Capacity, 1.8 million barrels per day. But the UAE's total export capacity is significantly higher than that, which means a large portion of UAE oil still needed the strait or needed to stop moving. What did the UAE do? Within weeks of the crisis beginning, Crown Prince Sheikh Khalid bin Mohammed bin Zayed announced the acceleration of a parallel pipeline project, a second ADCOP line that would double Fujairah's bypass capacity to 3.6 million barrels per day by mid-2027. That is not a bureaucratic decision. That is a strategic declaration. The UAE is not waiting for this crisis to end and then returning to the old model. The UAE is using this crisis to permanently restructure how it exports energy, and what nobody is mentioning is the deeper signal embedded in that decision. When the UAE doubles its bypass capacity, it reduces its structural dependence on the strait, and by extension, reduces its dependence on whatever political arrangement eventually governs the strait. Whether that arrangement is American-led, Iranian-influenced, or some Omani-brokered framework, the UAE is building a position where it needs that arrangement less than it did before. That is a different kind of power than pipeline capacity. That is strategic autonomy. Now let's talk about the country in the most structurally vulnerable position of any Gulf state, Qatar. Qatar is the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. It supplies roughly 20% of global LNG demand. Its entire economy, the sovereign wealth fund, the foreign policy, the 2030 vision, the World Cup infrastructure, all of it rests on one assumption, that LNG keeps flowing out of Ras Laffan. Ras Laffan sits on the Gulf Coast, inside the strait. There is no pipeline that carries LNG around Hormuz. LNG requires specialized tankers. Those tankers need the strait, and the strait is closed. Qatar's GDP is projected to shrink by 13% in 2026, the worst contraction of any Gulf state. Iranian strikes hit the Ras Laffan facility directly in March. The North Field expansion, Qatar's plan to increase LNG capacity from 77 to 142 million tons per year by 2030, now faces a revised timeline and revised security assumptions entirely. What's particularly revealing about Qatar's position is this. Qatar remembers the 2017 blockade. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt cut off Qatar diplomatically and economically for 3.5 years. Qatar survived by pivoting to Iran and Turkey for supply routes. So Qatar's relationship with both Iran and Saudi Arabia is complicated historically, structurally, and now economically. This is why Qatar is calling for freedom of navigation and consensus among regional states on future arrangements for the strait, not because Qatar is neutral, but because Qatar, more than any other Gulf state, needs a negotiated framework that doesn't leave it permanently at the mercy of whoever controls the northern shore. Let's take a step back, because this is the moment to ask the real question. Why does Qatar not have bypass infrastructure like Saudi Arabia and the UAE? The answer is geology and geography. LNG cannot travel by pipeline the way crude oil can, at least not at the distances and volumes Qatar requires. Qatar's gas comes out of the North Field, gets processed at Ras Laffan, and has to leave by tanker. The sea is the only option, which means Qatar's strategic vulnerability is not a failure of planning. It is structural. It is baked into the physics of the commodity Qatar chose to build its economy around. And that structural vulnerability is now fully exposed for the entire world to see. Kuwait and Iraq are the Gulf states that don't get mentioned in these conversations, and they should. Kuwait exports roughly 2 million barrels of oil per day. Almost all of it goes through the strait. Kuwait has no significant bypass infrastructure. It has been struck by Iranian missiles and drones. And Kuwait has the additional complication of being directly adjacent to Iraq, which itself exports roughly 3.3 million barrels per day, also almost entirely through the strait. Iraq is pursuing a Mediterranean corridor, a pipeline through Turkey and Syria that would allow Iraqi oil to reach European markets without touching the Gulf. Projected timeline, 3 to 5 years. The project is moving, but not fast enough to matter for this crisis. And what nobody is talking about is the political problem embedded in Iraq's situation specifically. Iraq has an Iran-aligned government. It has Iran-backed militias operating within its territory. And it is simultaneously a major oil exporter that depends on the same strait that Iran is using as a weapon. Iraq cannot publicly align against Iran, but Iraq's economy is being destroyed by the closure Iran imposed. That contradiction, being economically strangled by your political patron, is creating internal pressure in Baghdad that has not yet become visible internationally, but it will. And then there is Oman. Oman is the most strategically unique country in this entire picture, and it is the one that receives the least analytical attention. Oman borders the strait on the southern side, but Oman also has an extensive coastline on the Gulf of Oman, outside the strait entirely. Oman's main ports, including Duqm and Salalah, are outside Hormuz. Oman can export without the strait, but more importantly, Oman is the only country in the region that has maintained diplomatic relationships with both the United States and Iran simultaneously, across decades, across administrations, across crises. Oman has historically served as the back channel between Washington and Tehran. The secret nuclear negotiations of 2013 that led to the JCPOA were facilitated through Muscat. And right now, in August 2026, Oman is negotiating directly with Iran over safe shipping routes through the strait. Iran is talking to Oman because Oman is the only party Iran trusts enough to talk to. The United States is pressing Oman to not facilitate Iranian toll arrangements. Trump threatened Oman directly in May, and Oman is navigating between those two pressures with the particular kind of diplomatic patience that comes from having done this before. Here is what the data suggests about Oman's position. Oman is not a neutral mediator acting out of principle. Oman is a strategically positioned actor that has identified an opportunity. If the final arrangement governing Hormuz transit is negotiated through Oman, if Muscat becomes the administrative seat of whatever framework eventually regulates this choke point, Oman's strategic value to every party in this conflict increases permanently. That is worth more to Oman than any pipeline. Let me now bring this together because the individual country stories matter less than the structural pattern they reveal. Before this crisis, the Gulf Cooperation Council operated on a shared assumption. The strait stays open, the oil flows, the money comes in, and differences in strategic position can be managed through diplomacy and shared institutions. That assumption is gone. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have demonstrated they can operate without the strait at reduced but survivable export levels. Qatar and Kuwait cannot. Iraq cannot. Bahrain cannot. That asymmetry between the countries that have bypass infrastructure and the countries that don't is now the defining fault line of Gulf geopolitics. More than Iran, more than the U.S. relationship, more than the Abraham Accords or NEOM or any vision document. History shows that when the economic positions of allied states diverge this dramatically, the political alignment follows usually within a decade, sometimes faster. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are accelerating their exits from Hormuz dependence. They are building the infrastructure of strategic autonomy. Qatar and Kuwait and Iraq are being forced toward a negotiated framework. Any negotiated framework because they have no structural alternative. Those are not the same strategic interests. And the GCC was not built to manage that divergence. So where does this go from here? Let me give you 3 scenarios, and I want your reaction to each one. The first scenario is permanent fragmentation. Saudi Arabia and the UAE complete their bypass expansions by 2027. They achieve genuine export independence from the strait. Qatar and Kuwait, unable to build equivalent alternatives, are effectively forced into a separate diplomatic track, negotiating a Hormuz transit framework with Oman and Iran as intermediaries. The GCC does not formally dissolve, but it functionally splits into 2 tiers, the states that have exited Hormuz dependence and the states that haven't. The conditions for this scenario: continued U.S.-Iran hostility beyond 2026, no comprehensive transit agreement, and the UAE pipeline reaching its projected 2027 capacity on schedule. The second scenario is an Oman-brokered transit framework. Oman successfully negotiates a multilateral agreement governing Hormuz transit. Iran accepts a formal arrangement, perhaps a toll system, perhaps a joint monitoring body, in exchange for sanctions relief or a security guarantee. The strait reopens under a new legal and political architecture. Qatar's LNG flows again. Kuwait's exports resume. The GCC stabilizes, but around a framework that Iran has a formal role in. This scenario is possible, but it requires every party to accept something they currently don't want to accept. That is a high bar. The third scenario, and honestly the most realistic one, is frozen asymmetry. The strait partially reopens enough to reduce the immediate economic pressure, but no comprehensive framework is established. Shipping resumes at reduced volume, under constant threat, with periodic closures. Saudi Arabia and the UAE continue their bypass build-out regardless, because they now understand that full dependence on the strait is a structural risk they cannot accept. Qatar operates in a state of managed uncertainty. Its North Field expansion slows. Its LNG contracts are renegotiated with security clauses. Its foreign policy becomes more explicitly focused on transit security than it has ever been before. And the GCC continues to function as an institution. Meetings, statements, cooperation frameworks, while the underlying divergence in strategic position grows quietly, month by month, infrastructure project by infrastructure project. History shows this is usually how structural shifts happen. Not with a dramatic rupture, with a slow, steady repositioning that only becomes legible in retrospect. Honestly, and I want your opinion on this. Which of these three scenarios do you think is most likely? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. So let me bring this together in a single frame. The Strait of Hormuz closed in February 2026. That is the event everyone is covering. But the real story is what happened next inside the Gulf, among the states that were supposed to share the same strategic interests. Saudi Arabia activated its bypass and ran it at full capacity. The UAE announced a pipeline expansion that will double its exit from Hormuz dependence. Qatar watched its GDP projection fall by 13% and called for negotiations. Kuwait and Iraq have no alternative and no timeline for one. And Oman, quiet, patient, historically positioned, is sitting at the table with both Washington and Tehran, holding the only diplomatic asset that both sides currently need. The strait may reopen. Probably will in some form, under some arrangement, at some cost. But the structural map of the Gulf has already changed. The bypass infrastructure being built right now will outlast this crisis by decades. The fractures in strategic position exposed by this closure will not be papered over again as easily as they were before. The question is no longer whether the strait is open or closed. The question is, who controls the architecture of whatever comes next? And the answer to that question, more than any military campaign, more than any diplomatic communique, will determine who holds power in this region for the next generation. Tell me in the comments, which country do you think comes out of this crisis in the strongest long-term position? Like this video if the analysis was useful. Subscribe if you want to understand not just what is happening, but why it keeps happening, and what comes next. Stay sharp, the next shift is already in motion.